The first time Elizabeth saw the photograph, it looked like 100 others she had catalogued that month. A German immigrant family in 1901, carefully posed in a Philadelphia studio. The father seated in a carved wooden chair, the mother standing with her hand resting gently on his shoulder. 3 children arranged like small satellites around their parents, all dressed in their best clothes, all holding the solemn stillness that studio portraits required in the age of long exposure. It was the kind of image that usually passed through the archives unnoticed, filed under a name, a date, a street address, and then forgotten again. But this one did not let go. Dr. Elizabeth Carter had spent years in the quiet, fluorescent-lit rooms of the University of Pennsylvania archives, tracing stories buried in paper, ink, and fading photographs. As a historian of early 20th century immigration, she knew what immigrant family portraits were supposed to look like: hopeful, dignified, a carefully constructed declaration. We belong here. On a gray November afternoon, she was scrolling through yet another batch of digitized glass plate negatives from a long-closed Philadelphia studio when this particular family appeared on her screen. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. The date in the studio ledger read March 19th, 1901. The notation beneath it: Wagner family, 1247 North 2nd Street, $2. Father, mother, 3 children. A familiar shape in a sea of similar lives. Elizabeth moved her cursor to tag the image, surname, date, location, when something in the father's face stopped her. He was not younger or older than most men she saw in such photographs. The ledger listed him as 34. He wore a dark suit with a stiff, high collar and narrow tie. Clothes that had probably cost him more than he could comfortably afford. His hair was combed back, his mustache trimmed in a way that seemed almost aggressively proper. The technical quality of the photograph was excellent. The studio had done good work. And yet, behind the formal posture, behind the frozen stillness the exposure time forced on him, there was something wrong. It was in the eyes. Studio portraits from this era shared a certain guarded seriousness. People did not smile, cameras were rare and expensive, and families approached the lens with a kind of reverence. But this man's expression did not look simply solemn. His eyes were tight around the edges, a tension pulling at the muscles just beneath the surface. His jaw seemed clenched, his shoulders held, not with pride, but with a kind of controlled stiffness, as if he were bracing himself against something no one else in the room could see. Elizabeth leaned closer to the screen without realizing she was doing it. He looked, she thought, not like a man posing for a family portrait, but like a man trying very hard to pass as someone whose life was entirely ordinary. There were other details, small but insistent. The mother, Anna, according to the ledger, stood beside him with her hand on his shoulder, the gesture intimate yet strangely careful. Her fingers rested on the thick fabric of his coat, not on his neck or the side of his face. The children, a boy of 8, a boy of 6, and a girl of 4, stood in their places with the practiced seriousness of children who had been told very clearly to stand still. Nothing in their faces betrayed anything unusual, yet the longer Elizabeth stared, the more the arrangement itself felt like a kind of performance. She should have moved on. There were hundreds more images waiting in the queue. Instead, she opened the zoom tool. The first level of magnification showed what she expected. Fabric texture, the fine pattern on Anna's dress, the delicate stitching of the boys' collars. The studio's lens had been sharp. The digitization process had captured far more detail than the prints themselves had ever revealed. Another click, another level of zoom. The father's face filled the screen, pores, faint lines, the grain of the glass plate translated into pixels. His eyes, enlarged, no longer looked simply tense. They looked wary. Elizabeth zoomed down toward the high collar of his shirt, following some quiet instinct she could not have explained if someone had asked. At the precise line where the white collar met the shadowed skin of his neck, the image blurred into darkness, the natural fall-off of light beneath the chin. She told herself she was imagining things. Then she saw it. The faintest suggestion of an irregular line beneath the shadow. Something almost, but not quite, hidden. She sat back slowly. An irregular line on the neck could be many things. A fold in the skin, a trick of shadow, a flaw in the emulsion. She had seen all of them before. But there was something about the way this line curved, broken and uneven, emerging for a moment from under the collar, and then disappearing again where fabric and shadow swallowed it. If she had not been looking specifically at this spot, she would have missed it entirely. The intercom crackled softly above her door. She jumped. "Elizabeth, you in there?" It was Marcus. Dr. Marcus Webb worked down the hall, his office perpetually cluttered with old lenses, scanners, and the quiet chaos of someone who thought in layers and wavelengths. He specialized in forensic historical analysis, an emerging field that merged archival research with advanced imaging techniques. For the past year, he had been using a new ultra-high-resolution scanner to pull hidden details from damaged or faded photographs, barely legible handwriting on folded letters, faint street signs in the background of tenement scenes, names on storefronts no one had noticed in a century. "Come in," she called, eyes still on the screen. He stepped inside, laptop under his arm. "You have to see what this new scanner does to those glass plates," he began. Then he saw her face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," she said, half to herself. He crossed to her desk. "What are we looking at?" She gestured to the monitor. "Wagner family, 1901. Immigrant portrait. It's probably nothing, but zoom in on the father's neck, just there, above the collar." Marcus bent closer, his expression shifting from curiosity to concentration. He narrowed his eyes, tracing the faint line. His mouth flattened. "You have the raw file?" She nodded. "From the original glass plate scan." "Send it to me," he said quietly. "I'll run it through the new process. Contrast enhancement, shadow lifting, micro-detail extraction. It might be an emulsion defect. It might be something else." She watched him for a moment. "You think it's a scar?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. 3 days later, he came back pale. Elizabeth had been expecting a casual update, a technical explanation, perhaps a note that the line was just a scratch or a developing flaw. Nothing more than history static. Instead, Marcus shut the door behind him, pulled up a chair, and set his laptop on her desk, with the grave care of someone placing evidence on the table. "You need to see this," he said. The image that appeared on his screen looked familiar at first. The same family, the same arrangement. But as he zoomed in, it became clear this was no ordinary reproduction. The level of detail was almost surreal. Individual threads in the father's tie, the tiny weave pattern in the boys' jackets, the grain of the wooden chair. Even the faint texture of the photographic paper was visible. The image so sharp It almost seemed to have been taken yesterday, rather than more than a century ago. Marcus guided the cursor to the father's neck and zoomed again. This time there was no ambiguity. The shadow beneath the collar was gone, peeled back by the algorithm's manipulation of contrast and luminance. The high, starched collar no longer entirely concealed what lay beneath. On the left side of the man's neck, running from just below the ear toward the hollow above the collarbone, was a scar. It was not small. It was not neat. It was the kind of scar that did not belong in a polite studio photograph. A long, irregular line with uneven edges, the texture of the healed tissue subtly different from the surrounding skin. When Marcus adjusted the virtual lighting, another line became visible just beside the first. Two parallel tracks of old violence, narrow and deadly. Elizabeth felt the air leave her lungs. "That," Marcus said, his voice tight, "is not a scratch on the plate. And it's not a minor accident. Look at the depth, the shape. This is a serious wound. Or rather, it was." He tapped a few keys, pulling up an overlaid analysis. Edge enhancement, curvature mapping, color-coded depth approximations, based on tonal variation. "I sent this crop to a medical historian at Hopkins," he said. "She studies historical injury patterns on old photos. Her initial read: knife wounds. 2 distinct lacerations. Parallel. Probably from a blade about 4 to 6 inches long. Deep enough that, when they were fresh, he should have died." Elizabeth could not look away from the neck. The studio collar suddenly looked less like a fashion choice and more like deliberate armor. The man's posture, head tilted slightly, chin angled down, seemed, in hindsight, not like a formal pose but like a practiced habit. The angle of someone who had spent years making sure that a particular part of his body remained in shadow. "He arranged himself to hide it," she said softly. And the photographer helped. Lighting, collar, head angle. It's all working to keep that scar invisible, at least at normal resolution. Marcus nodded. These portraits were expensive. People wore their best clothes, tried to look as respectable as possible. This man went to significant effort to make sure no one saw what happened to him. The question is, why? For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The image on the screen looked suddenly different. The family was the same: mother, father, 3 children. But the context had shifted. What had been a formal declaration of belonging now felt like a cover. A veneer stretched carefully over something darker. Something that did not fit the narrative of quiet, immigrant respectability. "Do we know who they are?" Marcus asked. Elizabeth reached for the studio log she had left open on her desk. "Wagner family," she read. "Father, Friedrich Wagner, age 34. Mother, Anna, 31. Children, Wilhelm, 8. Otto, 6. Margaret, 4. Address, 1247 North 2nd Street. March 19th, 1901. They paid $2. She turned to her computer, pulling up the 1900 Philadelphia City Directory. The address appeared quickly. Wagner, Friedrich. Occupation factory worker. The 1900 census confirmed the household, listing both parents as German-born, immigrated in 1895. "So he shows up in Philadelphia as a factory worker," Marcus said. "German immigrant, wife, kids, all very standard." "Maybe," Elizabeth murmured. She widened the search. Earlier directories, New York records, immigration lists. For Anna, records unfolded cleanly. A passenger manifest from 1893, arriving in New York with her parents, a trail through church records and neighborhood addresses leading to her marriage in Philadelphia in early 1896. For Friedrich, the trail was different. Behind 1896, there was nothing. No arrival record matching his age and name. No earlier entries in city directories. No trace of a past in the usual bureaucratic sediment that caught almost everyone who passed through East Coast ports in that era. On paper, he simply appeared in Philadelphia 1 year and never existed before. For a while, Elizabeth tried to explain it away. The name could be misspelled, records could be lost, a clerk could have written Wagner instead of Wagner, Friedrich instead of Friedrich, or vice versa. But the more she searched, the more the absence itself began to feel like a presence. A hole, exactly in the place where one man's history should have been. A man with a scar deep enough to kill him, whose official life began only after the likely date of the injury. The scar, Marcus said quietly, and the missing past, those aren't separate stories. Elizabeth stared at the photograph again. The father's face, in high resolution, had lost any illusion of simple solemnity. He did not look like a man merely holding still for a camera. He looked like someone who had already survived one attempt on his life, and understood that the past could, at any time, step back into the room. The rest of the family, frozen forever, in that moment of borrowed respectability, had no idea. The children's shoes were polished. The boy's hair had been carefully combed and parted. Margaret's dress, slightly too big, suggested a garment, borrowed or purchased second-hand, but meticulously cleaned. Anna's hand still rested on her husband's shoulder, in the same way, the gesture now unbearably poignant. A sign of solidarity with a man whose secrets she might not have known, whose lies would shape the fate of every person in that picture. Elizabeth felt a tightness in her chest she recognized from other investigations, the first pressure of a story that wanted to be told. "This is supposed to be a document of safety," she said. "A family claiming their place in a new country. But look at it now. Once you see the scar, once you know it's meant to be hidden, it's like the whole image is tilted. It's not just a portrait. It's evidence." Marcus leaned back in his chair, eyes still on the screen. "Whatever happened to this man before this photo was taken tried to follow him," he said. "He tried to bury it. He changed his life, maybe even his name. He dresses carefully, sits correctly, pays for a portrait that says, 'Respectable father, factory worker, immigrant success.' But the scar doesn't care about any of that. It's there, whether we see it or not. And once we do," Elizabeth said, "we can't unsee it." Outside, the November light was fading. Inside the archive office, the only illumination came from the screens and the thin strip of fluorescent glow over the doorway. The hum of the climate control sounded suddenly like distant static, the soft noise of a world that had moved on and forgotten the people inside this photograph. Elizabeth looked again at the date, March 19th, 1901. "They walked into that studio," she said quietly, thinking they were freezing a happy, respectable moment in time. They had no idea that, a century later, people would zoom in on a single inch of his skin and see the beginning of an entirely different story. Marcus closed his laptop halfway, leaving the enhanced image visible like a secret between them. "What you're really asking," he said, "is not what happened before this photograph. It's what this photograph was protecting." Elizabeth nodded. Because somewhere between the hidden scar and the missing records, between the carefully arranged family and the man with no past before 1896, a different narrative was forming. A darker, sharper thread running under the ordinary story of immigration and hard work. A thread of violence, concealment, and a life built on a lie so complete that even his children, even his wife, might never have known the truth. The photograph had been meant to show a family. Now, after a century of silence, it was about to show what that family had been standing in front of all along. And Elizabeth understood, with a clarity that made her stomach twist, that this was only the beginning. The man who called himself Friedrich Wagner seemed to appear in Philadelphia, the way a photograph appears in a tray of developer, suddenly, fully formed, as if he had always been there. But in the world Elizabeth and Marcus lived in, people did not simply appear. They left traces, signatures, ship manifests, church records, tax lists, fragments of themselves pressed into the paper systems of the late 19th century. For weeks after discovering the hidden scar on his neck, Elizabeth's work narrowed to a single obsessive question. Who was he before this picture? The records at first were cooperative, in a way that made what followed feel even more unsettling. In the 1900 Philadelphia census, he was exactly what the photograph suggested. Friedrich Wagner, 34, factory worker, born in Germany, immigrated 1895, living with his wife Anna and their 3 children in a row house on North 2nd Street. In the city directory for that same year, Wagner, Friedrich, laborer, 1247 and Fastis 2nd. It was a normal entry in a crowded column of names, indistinguishable from dozens of other German workers in the city. Everything about his life after 1896 made sense. It was everything before that refused to exist. Most German immigrants passed through the same choke points: Hamburg or Bremen, on one side of the Atlantic, New York, Baltimore, or sometimes Philadelphia, on the other. They appeared on ship manifests, their names written in the cramped handwriting of overworked clerks. Age, occupation, place of origin, destination. The federal government had grown meticulous by the 1890s. Paper followed people everywhere. Everyone Elizabeth knew left some kind of trail, except him. She searched variant spellings: Wagner, Wegner, Wegner, F. Wagner, Friedrich, with and without the E, casting the net wider and wider. She shifted ports, years, even presumed ages, in case the studio ledger had been a year off. Hundreds of German men named Friedrich came and went. None of them fit. None of them were heading directly to Philadelphia in 1895 and then disappearing into the exact life the 1900 records described. Maybe he came over through Canada, Marcus suggested one afternoon. Some immigrants did that to avoid inspection quotas, then crossed down. Elizabeth nodded and added Canadian ports to her long list of search parameters. She did not expect much. It felt less like following a trail and more like trying to find a shadow in fog. Days turned into a week, and slowly a pattern emerged, not in what she found, but in what she didn't. There was no trace of anyone matching his profile before 1896. No earlier address in another American city. No ship arrival. No draft registration in Germany. No marriage record under the name Wagner before Philadelphia. It was as if the universe had decided that this man would begin on American paper at the moment he married Anna. "People don't appear fully grown," Elizabeth muttered one evening, leaning back in her chair and rubbing her eyes. He had to come from somewhere. Everyone comes from somewhere. Marcus, sitting across from her with his laptop open, watched her for a moment. "Unless," he said quietly, "he came from someone else." She lowered her hands. "What do you mean?" Marcus turned his screen toward her. "Here's the thing. You're assuming the name we have is real and the missing records are the error. But what if it's the opposite? What if the records are fine, and the name is the lie? It was the kind of sentence that could have sounded melodramatic in another context. Here, with the enhanced photograph of a man hiding a near-fatal scar on his neck, open on a second monitor, it sounded like the first honest hypothesis anyone had spoken. Elizabeth stared at the census entry again. Friedrich Wagner, a perfectly ordinary name. A name that fit in among the others like it had always been there. A name that might have been chosen precisely because of that. Suppose, Marcus went on, that he arrived under another name entirely. Suppose that something happened, an accident, a crime we don't know yet, and he needed to disappear. Changing countries wasn't enough. He had to change who he was on paper. If that's the case, your search for Friedrich Wagner before 1896 will never work. Because he didn't exist then. Someone else did. The idea landed with a quiet inevitability that made Elizabeth's skin prickle. A man with no past. A man with a scar that someone clearly hadn't intended him to survive. A man who positioned his body in a family portrait like someone who had practiced hiding that part of himself for years. What kind of man needs to erase himself? She asked. Marcus didn't answer. Both of them already knew the shortest, ugliest list of possibilities. Criminal, informant, someone fleeing revenge, someone fleeing the law. We need a different approach, Elizabeth said. If we can't move backward through him, we move outward. If he is a lie, the story might be hiding in the systems around him, the ones that still think they're looking for someone else. They began with the most obvious connection: violence. The medical historian's report on the neck scar had been precise. Deep lacerations, parallel cuts from a 4 to 6 inch blade, likely inflicted 3 to 5 years before the 1901 photograph. The angle of the wounds and the damage pattern suggested a defensive struggle, not self-harm or accident. Whoever he had been before Philadelphia, someone had tried very seriously to kill him. If the attack had happened in the United States, there might be records. Attempted murders did not vanish quietly from police ledgers. Elizabeth turned her attention to late 1890s crime reports. In that era, information moved between cities by letter and telegraph. Jurisdictions sometimes shared details about fugitives whose trails they believed might cross state lines. The Philadelphia Police Archives, stored in bound ledgers and brittle folders in a municipal building that smelled faintly of dust and old ink, were not designed for ease of search. Crimes were logged chronologically, not by type or by injury pattern. The first day was discouraging. The second turned her methodical search into something closer to obsession. She was halfway through an 1897 volume when she found it, a thin New York file, copied and forwarded to Philadelphia as a routine information exchange. The suspect's name was not familiar. Heinrich Bowman, German, approximately 32 years old. Wanted for attempted murder in New York City, May 1897. Elizabeth's heart rate ticked up as she read. The physical description could have matched 1,000 men. Medium height, brown hair, build, neither particularly heavy nor particularly thin. Nothing obvious tied this Bowman to the man holding his children in the studio portrait, until she reached the line near the bottom of the page. Distinctive marking: victim reports inflicting defensive wounds on suspect's neck and face during struggle. Suspect believed seriously injured and may have sought medical treatment. She read it twice. A German man. Late 20s or early 30s. A violent attack in 1897. The victim had slashed his attacker across the neck. Nearby, in another building, an enhanced photograph of a German man who appears, without explanation, in Philadelphia in 1896, with a deep, life-threatening neck scar that a medical expert had dated to between 1896 and 1898, sat open on Marcus's screen. The two timelines slid toward each other, like magnets. "This doesn't prove anything," Elizabeth told herself out loud, aware of the historian's instinct to resist neat narratives. There were many German immigrants, many knife fights, many men with scars. But the coincidence was hard, sharp, and specific. She copied the file, her fingers shaking slightly as she took the photographs, and carefully returned the ledger to its shelf. Back in her office, she laid everything out like a case detective pinning threads on a board: the census entries, the city directories, the marriage certificate for Friedrich Wagner in 1896, the police notice for Heinrich Baumann the following year, the medical analysis of the scar, and the studio portrait that had started everything. "Walk me through it," Marcus said, pulling up a chair. She did. "A man named Heinrich Baumann lives in New York, in a boarding house," she began. "In May 1897, he attacks another German man, tries to strangle him. When that fails, he uses a knife. The victim fights back, cuts him across the face and neck badly enough that police think he might bleed out or seek serious medical care. Baumann flees and disappears. Police circulate his description. They never find him." She tapped another document. "In Philadelphia, a man named Friedrich Wagner appears in city records beginning in 1896. Marriage, directory, census. But there is no trace of him anywhere before that, under that name. His age matches Baumann's. He lives just far enough away from New York to be reachable by train, but far enough to start over in anonymity. He has a deep set of scars on his neck that a specialist dates to somewhere between 1896 and 1898. And when he sits for a family portrait in 1901, he does everything he can to hide those scars." Marcus leaned back slowly, exhaling through his teeth. "You think Friedrich is Baumann?" he said. "I think," Elizabeth replied carefully, "that a man wanted for attempted murder, last seen bleeding from deep neck wounds in 1897, could very plausibly be the same man who suddenly appears in Philadelphia with no prior history, a new name, and scars that line up exactly with those wounds." She let the implications hang there. If she was right, the father in the photograph was not just a man with a violent past. He was a man who had tried to kill someone, fled justice, and built an entirely new life under a false identity, marrying, having children, sitting for respectable portraits, all while the scar on his neck silently recorded a story. No one around him understood. "What about Anna?" Marcus asked quietly, eyes on the mother's face in the photograph. "Do we know if she knew?" The question had been haunting Elizabeth since she'd found the first record of their marriage. Anna's trail from Germany to Philadelphia was clean. Passenger lists showed her arriving as Anna Schiller with her parents in 1893. Church records documented her confirmation. In February 1896, she married Friedrich Wagner at St. Michael's Lutheran Church, a few months before he appeared in the city directory. He entered her life already transformed. There were no surviving letters from her, no diary entries. Only the official documents of births, addresses, a single immigration record, a marriage line in a church ledger, and her name next to his, in a studio ledger, under the date of their photograph. In the portrait, her hand rests on his shoulder with a gentleness that suggests trust. "I don't think she knew," Elizabeth said slowly. "Not then. Maybe not ever. And the scar? Marcus asked. You can't exactly miss a wound like that in person. Scars can have stories, Elizabeth replied. Railroad accident. Street fight back home. It was nothing. It happened years ago. If she had any doubts, she had no way to verify them. She was a young immigrant woman with limited English, 3 children, and no extended family nearby. The man in that chair was her entire financial world. They both looked at the children. In the enhanced image, the oldest boy, Wilhelm, stood with a small but unmistakable pride, his chin lifted just a little higher than his younger brother's. Otto, 6 years old, clutched one hand in the other, trying to hold still in a body that wanted to move. Margaret, 4, wore the kind of expression small children get when they can sense something serious is happening, but do not quite understand what. None of them, Elizabeth thought, had chosen to stand in front of a camera with a man who might not be the person he said he was. What happens now? Marcus asked. Elizabeth knew what he meant. Up until this point, the investigation had lived in the realm of suggestion and connection, a private matrix of possibilities. To carry it further would mean stepping into more exposed territory, into the lives of descendants who might still be alive, into the ethics of revealing a buried crime, into the uncomfortable reality that this story, compelling as it was, might never yield absolute proof. We keep going, she said. Outward and forward. We see what happened to him. Men who live like this don't usually get neat endings. She was right. Following the name Friedrich Wagner beyond the date of the photograph, the trail continued for only a few more years before it ended abruptly. He appeared in the 1901 and 1902 city directories, still at the same address, still listed as a factory worker. Then, in 1903, the directory changed. Wagner, Anna, widow, 1247 and second widow. Somewhere between the shutter click in that studio and the printing of that book, the man in the picture had died. There were many ways a working-class man could die in an industrial American city in 1902. Equipment failures, streetcar accidents, disease, alcohol, bad luck. Ordinary tragedies filled the death ledgers. But when Elizabeth pulled the death certificate, the cause of death was not ordinary. Cause of death. Homicide. Stabbing. For a long time she simply stared at the word, her mind running through the sequence again. A man in New York, 1897, who tried to strangle and stab another tenant in a boarding house before being slashed across the neck and fleeing. A man in Philadelphia, 1901, hiding a deep, life-threatening scar on his neck in a family portrait, living under a new name with a wife who believed herself married to a factory worker. A death record, 1902, stabbed to death in an alley near his work. It was as if the violence he had carried in his body, half concealed under starched cloth and careful posture, had finally found its way back to him. But that, Elizabeth knew, was the kind of poetic symmetry historians were trained to distrust. She needed to know more. The police incident report on his death was brief and painfully factual. He had been found, late in the evening, behind the factory where he worked. No weapon recovered. No witnesses willing or able to identify an attacker. The case had been investigated but ultimately remained unsolved. Yet even in the thin file, one detail stood out like a bruise. A supplementary note, added several days later, recorded the statement of a neighbor. 3 days before the murder, the neighbor had overheard shouting from the Wagner apartment. A man's voice, not Friedrich's, yelling in accented English, "I found you. And you thought you could hide. Elizabeth read the line aloud to Marcus. "It's him," she said, her throat suddenly dry. "If we're right, if Friedrich really was Bowman, someone finally caught up with him." She did not say the other name out loud yet, but it hovered there between them. The man from the New York police file, the boarding house victim who had survived, scarred and furious, vowing that he would not rest until justice was done. On paper, the Philadelphia police had been looking for an unknown assailant who had stabbed a quiet factory worker for no apparent reason. They had never known that the man on the ground might have been wanted 5 years earlier under a different name for trying to kill someone else. In the slight tilt of the father's posture in the 1901 photograph, in the high collar hiding the scar, in the absence of any past before 1896, Elizabeth could suddenly see something that had not been visible before. This family portrait was not just about a man who had remade himself. It was about the people who had no idea that their entire life rested on a lie. The photograph, on its surface, showed a moment of stability. A husband, a wife, 3 children, all holding still while the lens recorded their existence. But in the new light Elizabeth and Marcus had cast on it, the same image looked like something else entirely. A fragile construct built over quicksand, taken less than a year before someone from the man's erased past finally knocked on his door and said, "I found you." In that sense, the scar on his neck was more than an old wound. It was a timestamp. It marked not only where the blade had cut him years earlier in a New York boarding house, but also how far the consequences of that moment would reach. Into a new name, into a marriage, into the lives of 3 children who had never consented to inherit his secrets. The family portrait had been meant to show what they wanted the world to see. Now, piece by piece, it was starting to show everything they had never meant anyone to see at all. By the time Elizabeth began tracing what had happened after the murder, the photograph on her screen no longer looked like a relic. It looked like a fuse. The image had started as a curiosity, a family portrait with a hidden scar, but now it felt like the moment before a long, slow detonation. The father seated in the center of the composition was already dead by the time the ink dried on the city directory that first listed his wife as a widow. The scar on his neck had turned out to be not just a mark of past violence, but the leading edge of a chain reaction that would tear through every life in that photograph. The question that now consumed Elizabeth and Marcus was no longer, who was he? It was, what did his past do to the people who never chose it? They began, as always, with the paper. The year after the death certificate recorded cause of death, homicide, stabbing, the city directory entry for 1247 North 2nd Street changed. The husband's name vanished. In his place appeared a single line, Wagner, Anna, widow. There was an entire world folded into that one word, widow. It suggested a woman abruptly and brutally cut off from the fragile stability her husband's wages had provided. It suggested 3 children whose father had left home one morning and never come back. It suggested a story told in their tenement that would be repeated and edited until it hardened into family myth or dissolved into silence. What it did not say, anywhere, was that the man she had buried had probably never been who he said he was. For several weeks after that discovery, Elizabeth's days followed the same pattern. She would arrive at the archive, open the digitized photograph, read the names written beneath it, Friedrich, Anna, Wilhelm, Otto, Margaret, and then turned to the directories, census forms, and institutional ledgers that recorded the slow erosion of their lives. Anna had not disappeared, at least not at first. In the 1903 directory, she was still at the same address, now listed with an occupation: seamstress. It wasn't surprising. Factory work for women with children was difficult and often impossible. Employers preferred workers who could stay on the floor for long hours without needing to rush home to sick children or deal with childcare emergencies. Seam work, taken in by the piece, could be done from home, long after midnight if necessary, eyes burning in poor light, fingers bleeding from needles and rough fabric. It was precarious and poorly paid, but it was something. Elizabeth imagined Anna at that kitchen table, the same hands that rested gently on Friedrich's shoulder in the photograph, now pulling a needle through endless seams. She could almost hear the rasp of thread, the muffled coughs of children sleeping in the next room, the ticking of a cheap clock measuring out each exhausted hour. The city did not record those sounds. It recorded only that, within a year of her husband's murder, she had moved to a cheaper address in a more crowded neighborhood, the familiar migration path of a family sliding downward. School records picked up the children's names next. In the enrollment ledgers of a nearby public school, Elizabeth found all three of them: Wilhelm, now 12, Otto, 10, Margaret, 8, listed in the attendance columns. Their presence in these books was, in its own way, an act of resistance. Even when everything else was collapsing, Anna had gotten them through the school doors. The pattern of check marks and absent notations told a subtler story. Margaret's attendance was spotty, but mostly intact. Otto's was less stable, strings of absences appearing and breaking. Wilhelm's record, however, showed a boy present fewer and fewer days as months passed, gaps often clustered in winter, when heat and clothing mattered most. Next to his name, in a teacher's careful script, Elizabeth found a note that made her jaw tighten. Boy appears malnourished, clothing insufficient for cold weather. Recommend charity intervention. On the day they had stood in the studio, the children's clothes had looked modest, but decent, clean, pressed, a sign of effort. That moment, frozen in silver and light, came from a time before the wages stopped. Within a few years, the strain had become visible enough that a school teacher felt compelled to record it in an official ledger. The first real fracture appeared in 1906. In the records of the Pennsylvania Orphan Society, among pages filled with the usual entries: foundlings, children of dead or destitute parents, boys and girls removed from homes deemed unfit, Elizabeth found a familiar surname. Application: Otto Wagner, age 12. Attached to the intake form was a letter. The handwriting was careful, the grammar rough, the spelling uncertain but determined. It was written in English that carried the faint shadow of German structure, the kind of language that came from someone who had learned to survive in markets and factories rather than schools. I cannot feed my son proper, the letter read. He is good boy, but I have no money for enough food and no money for good clothes for school. My hands hurt from sewing, and I cannot see good any more from the close work and dark. Please take my boy and give him food in school. I will take him back when I can work more. Please help. Elizabeth had to stop for a moment after reading it. The historical distance between her and that letter evaporated. She could see Anna at a small table, tongue pressed to the corner of her mouth in concentration, forming each letter with the urgency of someone asking strangers to be kinder to her child than the world had been to her husband. She could feel, in the crooked lines and misspelled words, not ignorance, but desperation. The orphanage approved the application. Otto entered the institution in June 1906. Institutional logic presented this as an act of rescue. The boy would be fed, clothed, and schooled. At 14, he would be apprenticed to a trade. But in the space of a few years, the family that had once stood together in a studio was now being divided by necessity. First, the father's death. Then, the middle child's departure into an orphan system that rarely returned boys to their mothers. "They're being stripped down," Marcus said quietly when Elizabeth showed him the records. "Piece by piece. First the father, then one child, then—" He didn't finish. They did not have to wait long to see the next break. In 1907, the Ledger of Philadelphia General Hospital recorded the admission of Anna Wagner, age 38, diagnosed with exhaustion, malnutrition, and advanced tuberculosis. Her occupation was listed as seamstress. The notes mentioned that she had 2 children still at home, and that she asked repeatedly about son at orphan home. The hospital staff, recording facts rather than feelings, added that her prognosis was poor. Tuberculosis was a common killer in the tenements, carried in close, damp air and nourished by undernourishment. Overwork lowered the immune system. Long hours of sewing in bad light strained the lungs and eyes. The disease, what people then called consumption, had already hollowed out thousands of lives like Anna's. She lasted a few more months. On March 22, 1908, the death register recorded her name and age, and the bland finality of the cause: tuberculosis. The burial record listed the place: a potter's field on the edge of the city, a common grave for those too poor for a private plot. Next to her name, the clerk had written a single word that twisted like a knife when Elizabeth noticed it: unmarried. Somewhere between the boarding house where his throat had been cut and the alley where he had died, the man calling himself Friedrich had taken even that from her. In the absence of a husband to stand at the graveside, there had been only the institution, the ledger, and the anonymous earth. Elizabeth closed her eyes for a moment. The photograph from 1901, with Anna's hand resting on Friedrich's shoulder and her children gathered around them, now felt like a cruel prelude. She had been dead barely 7 years after it was taken. Otto had been given up to an orphanage 2 years before. Wilhelm, the oldest, had been dragged into factory work as soon as he was physically able to handle it. Margaret, 10, had been left in a world that had already taken almost everyone from her. The image had captured them just before the trap closed. "What about the children after she died?" Marcus asked. It was the only question left that could still offer any measure of hope. They traced Wilhelm first. In 1908, the year of his mother's death, his school attendance ceased completely. City directories from the following years listed a Wilhelm Wagner at various boarding house addresses: occupation, laborer, then machine operator. Like his father before him, he entered the rooms filled with metal and steam. In 1918, his name appeared again, this time on a World War I draft registration. He was 26, of average height and build, with brown hair and brown eyes, the same general description that had once applied to the man who might have been his father's original identity. In the line asking for nearest relative, he had written one word: none. Whether this was literal, emotional, or simply the easiest answer, Elizabeth could not know. But the fact remained. The boy standing beside his family in the photograph, his hand resting lightly near his father's chair, had grown into a man who, on official paper, claimed no one as his closest person. After the war, Wilhelm's trail turned faint. In the 1920 census, he appeared as a boarder in another man's house, still working in factories. In 1924, the record ended with a death certificate. Cause of death: workplace accident. No spouse, no children. Under informant, the line was left blank. Margaret's story unfolded along a more institutional track. A month after Anna's death, the records of a Catholic orphan home listed a new admission. Margaret Wagner, age 10. The notation included a single sentence that said more than it intended. Father deceased, mother deceased, brother unable to provide home for female child. The brother, by then 16, had been living in a boarding house and working full days in a factory. However much he might have wanted to keep his sister with him, the structures of the time made it nearly impossible. Landlords did not rent single rooms to teenage boys with younger sisters. Factories did not care for children while their workers pulled 12-hour shifts. He had done what his mother had done with Otto: surrendered someone he loved to an institution that promised survival, if not flourishing. Margaret remained at the orphan home until she turned 18. At that point, following standard practice, she was placed as domestic help in the household of a middle-class family on the city's outskirts. The orphanage records listed her departure, the name of the employing family, and nothing more. Otto's path, at least on paper, offered the only glimmer of something like stability. The Orphan Society had carried out its promise. At 14, he was apprenticed to a printing shop. His name appeared in trade records a few years later as a journeyman printer, then as a full employee. In 1920, a census entry showed Otto Wagner, age 26, married to a woman named Ruth, living in a modest but decent neighborhood. There were no children listed yet, but the household, with 2 adults and a rented home, looked almost ordinary. On his World War I draft registration, however, the line for nearest relative matched his brother's. None. Elizabeth stared at that word for a long time. Family names persisted. Bloodlines continued. But whatever had held them together in that studio chair in 1901 had not survived the next 2 decades. Whether by choice, distance, or sheer circumstance, the children of the man who had remade himself vanished into separate lives, disconnected from one another and from the truth about where their story had begun. The people who lived with the consequences, Marcus said one afternoon, eyes on the scattered copies of records across Elizabeth's desk, never got to know the causes. He wasn't wrong. Anna had died without ever learning that the man she'd married as a factory worker in Philadelphia had likely once been a violent would-be killer in a New York boarding house. The children had grown up carrying the shame and hardship of poverty, of a father killed in violence, without ever having the context that might have turned their story from random tragedy into something like a grim pattern. The only one who had ever known the whole arc, the attack in New York, the slash of glass or knife across the neck, the desperate escape to a new city, the change of name, the respectable marriage, the photograph, the knock on the door from the man who said, "I found you," was the man buried under the name Friedrich, and he had taken his truth with him into the ground. The photograph, though, had kept a fragment. When Elizabeth looked at it now, she no longer saw just the visible composition. She saw the invisible timelines radiating out from it. Anna stitching herself toward an early grave, Wilhelm learning to stand on vibrating factory floors, Otto sleeping in an institutional dormitory, Margaret learning to make beds in someone else's house, their extended family in Germany, perhaps never knowing what had happened to the branch that had crossed the ocean. The scar on their father's neck, half hidden under the collar, was no longer the most important wound in the picture. The real damage had gone the other way. The violence he had inflicted in that New York boarding house, whatever the precise circumstances, had returned not only to claim his life in an alley, but to hollow out the lives of people who had never raised a hand against anyone. "This is why the image hit so hard," Elizabeth said one evening, when they sat together in the dim office, with only the monitor lighting their faces. "At first you think the story is about him, the mysterious father with the scar and the false name, but the more you learn, the more you realize he's the least interesting part." Marcus nodded, eyes on Anna's face. "The real story," he said, "is about the people in the picture who never had a choice." For over a century, the photograph had sat in an archive box, its scar unseen, its secrets intact. Viewers would have glanced at it and seen nothing more than a stiff immigrant family in formal clothes. Scholars might have used it to illustrate lectures about assimilation, about German communities in Philadelphia, about studio portrait conventions in 1900. No one would have guessed that, hidden in a sliver of shadow at the base of the father's neck, was a knife cut that connected a New York boarding house, a Philadelphia crime, an unmarked grave, an orphanage, and a woman who had worked herself literally to death, trying to keep her children alive. No one would have known that the image did not just document a family. It documented a crime and its echo. It was only when the technology existed to pull more detail from old emulsion than the original photographer could ever have imagined that the scar surfaced fully into view. Only when historians like Elizabeth and Marcus had access to digitized census records, police files, and orphanage ledgers at their fingertips could they piece together the lives shattered by one man's choices. In that sense, Chapter 3 of their investigation was not just about the Wagners. It was about the way the past keeps its receipts in places no one thinks to look. The family in the photograph had stepped into a studio believing they were buying a simple thing, a printed image of themselves, proof that they had made it this far together. They could not have known that, on a distant computer screen over a century later, strangers would zoom in so far that they could see the violence in one man's skin and follow it outward into every ledger where his name, or the name he had stolen, appeared. They could not have known that what had once been a private scar, known only to a few, would eventually become a kind of testimony, not about his suffering, about theirs. By the time the article was published, the photograph had become something entirely different from what the Wagner family had paid for in 1901. It had begun as a performance, a father in his best suit, a mother in her carefully maintained dress, 3 children held still by the weight of parental instruction and the cost of the moment. It was meant to say, "We are here. We are respectable. We belong." It ended more than a century later as something else, a piece of evidence in a case the police had never solved, a visual testimony to how far one man's secret could reach beyond his own life. For Elizabeth, The fourth and final stage of the story was not about discovering one more hidden document or tracking down a final address. It was about deciding what to do with the truth they now held. The investigation had given them what historians almost never receive: a narrative that locked together with unnerving clarity. A man with a violent past, a change of name, a hidden scar, a reappearance in a different city, a second act of violence that mirrored the first, and the long, quiet implosion of a family caught in the blast radius. But clarity was not the same as justice. Justice, if it had ever been done at all, had come in a dark alley in 1902, when someone found the man who had tried once before to kill them, and did not miss the second time. What remained in the 21st century were not perpetrators and victims in any legal sense. What remained were descendants. Elizabeth and Marcus knew they were no longer working only with the dead. At some point, the children who had been scattered by poverty and institutions had grown up, had children themselves, and passed down fragments of memory in the form of stories, silences, or names no one quite understood. They had to decide whether to leave the truth in the archive, sealed between covers and cardboard, or to put it back into circulation. The first step was academic. They drafted the article with the caution of people walking across ice that had only recently frozen. Every claim was backed by documentation. Every inference marked clearly as such. They did not write even once that Friedrich Wagner was definitely Hinrich Böhme. Instead, they laid out the converging lines of evidence, the matching time frame of the wound, the disappearance of Böhme from New York records, the simultaneous appearance of Wagner in Philadelphia with no prior history, the scar, the police note about a visitor shouting, "I found you," the subsequent murder, the departure of Böhme's victim back to Germany. They presented it as a highly probable reconstruction, a phrase that balanced on the knife edge between certainty and humility. The photograph, reproduced in the journal with the scar subtly enhanced, but not grotesquely highlighted, anchored the article. The image forced readers to confront the human faces behind the string of documentary citations. The man whose past had finally found him, the woman whose life had been consumed in the aftermath, the children who had been pushed into orphanages, factories, and boarding houses by the absence no death certificate could fully describe. But the journal was only one audience. The harder conversation lay outside academia. "It's their story," Marcus said one afternoon, gesturing at the photograph. "But they never got to know it. We've built something that feels like closure. The question is, are we the ones who are supposed to hold it?" Elizabeth had already been thinking the same thing. Using the names and dates they had traced in the records, they identified a likely line of descendants, not from Wilhelm, who had died unmarried in an accident, nor from Margaret, whose later life remained frustratingly hazy, but from Otto, the boy who had been sent to the Orphan Society, apprenticed to printing, and eventually built a stable life with his wife Ruth. Through census data, marriage certificates, and modern public records, they followed the trail forward until it ended in a living address. The day Elizabeth wrote the first email, she found herself revising every sentence 3 or 4 times. How do you tell someone that a photograph of their ancestors, taken more than a century earlier, contains evidence that their great-grandfather was almost certainly living under a false name after attempting murder in another city? How do you say that the man whose surname they still carry had built his family on a stolen identity and a concealed past? She began not with the crime, but with the scar. They were historians, she explained, working on a project involving early 20th century immigrant photography. While digitizing glass plate negatives from a Philadelphia studio, they had come across a portrait of a family whose names matched the recipient's known ancestors. Modern imaging techniques had revealed a hidden scar on the father's neck, and further research into city records, police files, and institutional archives had uncovered a complex, difficult history that had been invisible to previous generations. If the family was willing, she wrote, she and her colleague would be honored to share the findings in detail, privately at first, with no obligation to consent to publication or publicity. The reply came 3 days later. It was brief, polite, and cautious. The family had grown up with only scattered stories about a hard life in the early 1900s. They knew of a mother who died young, of children in institutions, of a father mentioned only in hushed tones. Names had blurred over time. Details had been lost. If Elizabeth and Marcus had found something that could explain the shadows in their family stories, they wanted to know. The first meeting took place over video. On Elizabeth's screen, 3 generations appeared. An older man in his 70s, his daughter in her 40s, and her teenage son. Behind them, on a shelf, were the familiar signs of quietly lived lives: family photos, a potted plant, a stack of books. They didn't look like people waiting to hear that a ghost was about to climb out of the past and sit down in the room with them. Elizabeth introduced herself and Marcus again, explained the project, and shared her screen. When the 1901 photograph appeared, there was a small collective intake of breath. They were seeing people they had only heard about in fragments. The names matched. The ages lined up. The children in the picture had become the grandparents and great-grandparents whose absence and presence had shaped the lives of everyone on the call. The older man leaned closer, eyes narrowed. "She looks like my aunt," he said softly, pointing at Margaret. "The mouth, the eyes. We always wondered who we got that from." Elizabeth zoomed in gradually, explaining the studio, the date, the cost. She told them about the address on North 2nd Street, the father's listing as a factory worker, the normalcy that surrounded the image on paper. Then she zoomed in further, down toward the high collar. Even over a compressed video connection, the scar remained visible. She explained what the imaging had revealed, what the medical historian had concluded about the nature of the wound, its depth, its likely cause, its timing. Then she laid out as gently as she could the possibility that the man in the photograph had once borne a different name, in a different city, under very different circumstances. She did not use language of accusation or condemnation. She used the language of evidence, likelihoods, convergences, patterns. On the other side of the call, the 3 listeners sat very still. It was the daughter who finally asked the question Elizabeth had been waiting for. "So what you're saying," she said slowly, "is that my great-grandfather tried to kill someone, got his throat cut instead, ran away, changed his name, and started over here. And then somebody found him and finished it." Elizabeth nodded once. "That is what the records strongly suggest, yes. We can't claim absolute certainty about every detail, but the overlap is unusually specific." The older man was silent, eyes still on the image. "What about her?" he asked quietly, pointing at Anna. "What happened to her?" Elizabeth told them in measured sentences. The seam work, the letter to the Orphan Society about Otto, the hospital admission, the tuberculosis, the unmarked grave where she'd been buried under the label unmarried. She did not dwell on the pain, but she did not look away from it either. "And the children?" the daughter asked. She told them about Wilhelm's draft card listing none as his nearest relative, about his death in a factory accident. She told them about Margaret's placement in a Catholic orphan home and later in domestic service. She told them about Otto's apprenticeship in printing and the family that eventually descended from him. At one point, the teenage boy, the great-great-grandson of the man in the photograph, shifted in his chair. "So," he said, "we're here because a guy tried to murder someone, got away, pretended to be somebody else, and then got murdered anyway. And everybody after him had to pay for it." It was blunt in a way only teenagers and historians usually managed. Elizabeth did not try to soften it. "In a sense, yes," she said. "He made a violent choice. That choice led to a chain of events that shaped the lives of people who never had any control over what he had done. Your existence is not his crime. But the way your family's story unfolded, the poverty, the early deaths, the orphans, those things are connected to decisions he made before this photograph was taken." There was a long silence. The older man finally exhaled. "My grandmother never talked about her father," he said. "She talked about her mother, always about how hard she worked, how sick she was. She said her mother died from life being too much. That's how she put it. Whenever we asked about her father, she would just say, 'He died in badness.' I never knew what that meant. I thought maybe he drank too much or got into fights." He shook his head slowly. "Looks like she knew more than she told." For the first time in all the months of research, Elizabeth felt something shift that could not be captured in an archive. This, she realized, was the other half of historical work, the part that did not end with an article or a footnote, but with a family reinterpreting its own past. From that day forward, the photograph did not belong only to the archive. It belonged again to the people whose faces it showed, and to their descendants, who now understood that the scar on the father's neck, once literally invisible, represented not just a brush with death, but a hidden axis around which their entire family history had turned. When the article appeared in print, it attracted more attention than most academic work ever did. The combination of human drama and technical novelty, the old photograph, the high-tech enhancement, the crime revealed only through zoom, made for irresistible headlines and summaries. But for Elizabeth, the most important part of the story could not be captured in a press release. What mattered to her were the long-term implications. This case proved, in a way that could not easily be dismissed, that some of the deepest truths about the past were sitting in plain sight, in boxes and drawers and envelopes, waiting for someone with the right tools and the right patience to look closer. It showed that family photographs, often treated as sentimental objects, could also be forensic evidence. It showed that the systems designed to record lives, police files, immigration logs, orphanage ledgers, could be cross-woven into a kind of retrospective justice. It also forced her to confront the ethics of her own profession. There was power in being able to uncover a story that the people living it had never been allowed to understand. There was responsibility in deciding how and when to reveal it. And there was humility in recognizing that no matter how compelling the reconstruction, some parts would forever remain out of reach. Elizabeth had never found, for example, a confession from the man who had likely killed Friedrich Heinrich. She had never discovered a diary in which Anna wrote her private doubts or fears. No record existed of the exact words spoken in the argument the neighbor overheard. Only the remembered phrase, "I found you, and you thought you could hide." The act of interpretation was unavoidable. "What do we do with stories like this?" Marcus asked her one evening after the wave of public interest had crested and receded. "Beyond publishing them, beyond putting them in journals or documentaries, what are they for?" Elizabeth thought of the scar, once hidden and now visible. "They're reminders," she said finally, "that the past isn't just dates and laws and presidents. It's decisions. Some of them are private, some of them are violent, and the consequences don't stop when the people who made them die. They move forward into other people's lives, wives, children, neighbors, descendants, whether anyone tells the story or not." The photograph had begun its life as an attempt to freeze time. In the end, it had done something more complicated. It had captured a moment in which everyone in the frame was balanced on the edge of events they could not yet imagine. A man sitting in a borrowed identity, believing his secret was safely buried. A woman touching his shoulder, believing her marriage was built on solid ground. 3 children standing in their best clothes, believing, if they believed anything at all in that instant, that adulthood would be something reachable and coherent. History had proved all of them wrong. The father's secret did not stay buried. The mother's life did not unfold in safety. The children's path to adulthood was broken into pieces by institutions. And yet, more than a century later, their faces were still here. Their story, once scattered, had been gathered. Their suffering, once anonymous, had been named. That, Elizabeth thought, was the only kind of redemption the past could offer. Not for the man who had inflicted harm and then tried to outrun it, but for the people whose lives had been crushed beneath his choices. The final time she closed the file on her computer, she paused over the image one last time. She did not zoom in on the scar. She did not look for new details in the father's eyes. Instead, she looked at Anna's hand. It rested lightly on his shoulder, fingers curved, knuckles soft. That hand had written the letter asking for her son to be taken into care so he could eat. It had pulled thread through cloth until the joints swelled and the skin split. It had likely covered the mouths of coughing children at night, wiped their faces in the morning, and smoothed down their hair on the day they walked into the studio. No camera had recorded those gestures, but they were there, in the calluses, in the posture, in the way she stood. This, she thought, was the final shift the story demanded. To move the narrative weight away from the man who had claimed the center of the frame and toward the people around him whose lives had carried the true cost. The photograph had been created to honor the father's presence. History, belatedly, had turned it into testimony of everyone else's endurance. In that transformation, from posed pride to exposed truth, Elizabeth saw the larger purpose of her work, not to condemn the long dead, nor to sensationalize their failures, but to illuminate the quiet, unchosen heroism of those who lived in the wake of someone else's violence. The scar in the picture had started the story. The hand on the shoulder was where it ended.